I've thought about, why did this episode do so well and how do I grow the podcast? And I think the answer is just consistency, but not just in terms of releasing episodes, but in terms of quality. The better the episodes are, the more people are likely to share them with their friends and listen to them multiple times. And so the podcast grows.
I'm throwing the formal intro out the window. I'm talking to a good friend of mine. I could call him my business mentor, and most importantly, he's my first podcast client. He's Courtland Allen, and he's the founder of indiehackers.com. Real quick, could you introduce yourself and kind of give us an overview of your business and your podcast?
What's up, Brad? My name is Courtland Allen. I run an online community of founders called Indie Hackers. It was acquired by Stripe a couple years ago, and it basically consists of thousands of people who want to start online businesses. Most of them are developers, and they're just kind of helping each other out, sharing their stories, talking about how much money they're making and how they're coming up with their ideas and how they're following up with their customers and finding their first customers, etc. So it's basically an online community, and a significant part of that is the podcast, which you've been helping me edit for several years now. The podcast is super simple. I just bring founders on from the website or founders that I hear about from other channels, and I ask them the same questions that we talk about on the forums. So again, how do they get their businesses to where they are today? And the goal is to basically inspire listeners to start their own companies and show that it's not as hard as it may seem. And also to give them some educational tips and details on how they can do it.
I think it's going to be super interesting when we dive into exactly how the podcast has influenced the community and vice versa. But I think starting out, I want to touch on how we started working together, because it's actually a funny story from my end, but I want to ask you if you remember like exactly how we started working together.
Yeah, I do. I remember the vague outline. It's funny, I remember telling people about it more than I remember the actual thing, because I've told it to so many people. But I'm trying to scroll back through my emails so I can figure out exactly what was said, because I'm pretty sure you reached out to me right as I was starting the podcast, like right after I launched it, or maybe even before I launched it, when I was just talking about launching it. And you were like, hey, I would love to edit your podcast for you. And at that time, I was like, no, I'm going to do everything by myself. I was very stuck on like Indie Hackers is a one-man show, and I'm going to do everything by myself, and it's going to be so cool and so impressive that I'm doing it all. And so I was doing like all of the editing, all the production stuff, splicing in the intro music and the outro music, and just cleaning up the episode completely solo. And to the best of my memory, you were like very persistent. You would email me, and I'd be like, nah, I'm good. And you email me again, I'd be like, nah, I'm good. And then I think one time you emailed me with 2 audio files, like, here's your version, Courtland, here's my version. And it was so much better. It was like so obviously better that I was like, all right, I'm stupid for continuing to try to do this on my own. It makes no sense. And so I think I was like, yeah, look, give it a shot with the next episode and we'll see how it goes. And you did a great job. And the rest has been history.
That's so crazy. Because like, honestly, what I was doing at that time, I was just starting out and I had gotten banned from Upwork. And I had like made $400 my first week on Upwork, but I ended up trying to extract work from the platform, and I didn't know it would result in permaban. So the next thing I thought, like I took a week to be depressed, and then I was like, okay, I got to do something. And I remember going to the iTunes charts and looking at like the new and noteworthy business podcasts, because I always had like a love for business. And I was already listening to a bunch of shows like yours. So I was like, hey, I actually like this show. Let me reach out and see if I can help. And I remember you telling me no at least like 3 or 4 times. Yeah. But I eventually showed you how it could be improved. And yeah, the rest is history. And I love that story because that's such an indie hacker story.
It really is. How did Upwork know that you're taking work off their platform? I'm curious.
They flag whenever you mention like PayPal or Stripe or any kind of like third-party payment processors. Yeah.
Gotcha.
But yeah, it's so much bigger than that though. I want to really discuss the benefits a host can expect from outsourcing production like that. Like I want this conversation to really dive into my perspective as like the freelancer offering the service, and you as the host like using that service to essentially buy yourself time to focus on more important tasks. So when I reached out initially like that and you trusted me with the production, what did that extra time do for Indie Hackers?
Yeah, the way I thought about it was as I said, Indie Hackers at that time was a one-person company. It was just me. And when you've got an early stage one-person company, you really have to be good at prioritization because there's so much stuff you could do. Like people will send you good ideas all the time. And they're not bad ideas, but you still end up saying no because they're not the best ideas and you don't have time to work on every good idea. And so for me, it was pretty simple. You were going to do a better job editing the podcast than I was. I was a little bit hesitant to hiring back then because I was just, I don't know, I didn't want to put in the upfront work to vet someone or train someone to bring them up to speed, but you're instantly like a yes because you knew exactly what you were doing. You could do a better job than I was, so I didn't have any of that upfront cost. And so it was kind of a no-brainer. Yeah, I can let Bradley handle this editing stuff, and then I can go on to do other things. And like that's going to depend on what your business is, whether or not you have valuable other activities. Like if your business is literally 100% just a podcast, maybe it won't be as impactful. But even then, you can focus more on finding good guests and writing up good questions for those guests and advertising and promoting your podcast. Like there's so many different things you can do with your business. For me with Indie Hackers at the time, I was very focused on selling ads and trying to monetize the community. That was selling newsletter ads and website ads and podcast ads. And that was taking up a ton of my time, plus editing the podcast as well, plus booking new guests, plus managing the forum and coding it. And so every hour that I had that was free to basically work on that stuff was huge for me. And editing the podcast was taking me something like 5 or 6 hours an episode back then because I was just so slow. It was like a whole day of work pretty much. So it was an extra day for me of work and it was super valuable.
And from my perspective as the freelancer, like obviously it was work to do, and keeping it with the idea of the host in mind, what I've found just in my experience is that like the hosts that are running businesses that promote their business with the podcast are the ones that need the help the most. Whereas if you're a podcaster with a talk show or anything that's like solely personality or news based, things like that, yes, you can monetize with ads and stuff like that. But I try to get people to think of it like another way because I've been able to build an entire career off of essentially helping you with Indie Hackers. Like that was... Your show was my foot in the door to everything I'm doing now. And I feel like there's countless people out there that could do the same.
So what you're saying is you should have been the one paying me to edit the Indie Hackers podcast. It was a really good deal. I think you were super cheap back then. Like
yeah.
My other podcast friend had an editor and I think he was paying them like $20 an episode or something. And so like our arrangement was like relatively similar. I think it was more than that, but still like easily affordable.
35.
Yeah, it was like $35 an episode, and that was like one episode a week. So for me, it was like no brainer. I would definitely pay $35 to get a free day every week.
Right, and what that looked like for me is like I was taking, going back to what I said earlier, is like I was taking the skills I already had. Like I started in music production, so I was recording bands, and I was using microphones and stuff. All I did was transfer those skills into a service. So if you're a podcaster with your own show and you need help to work on your business, then that's a good time to outsource. But when you're looking to translate that into a career, you could consider basically copy pasting what you're already doing for yourself for others. But enough on that. I feel like I'm talking way too much. Let's talk about the community aspect. Podcasting is a great new media for connecting with your audience on a very deep level. I know when you first started, you were just doing the forum and the podcast was kind of on the side.
Yeah.
But it feels like these days the podcast is almost like number one.
It's pretty close.
What does that look like on the back end?
So I'm looking at I sent out a survey to people when they first join Indie Hackers, and I ask, which parts of the site are you most familiar with? And you can choose up to 3. And right now it's like 49.4% of respondents say the forum, and then 46.3% say the podcast. So it's number 2 by like a razor thin margin. And then there's like 10 other parts of Indie Hackers that come that are like distant 3rd, 4th, 5th, etc. So the podcast is huge. As to your question of what that looks like on the back end, looks like me spending a lot of time on the podcast. I spend a ton of time researching guests, figuring out who to bring on, asking people for recommendations, recording episodes and scheduling episodes, and pretty much putting them out there and promoting them. In recent weeks, I've tried to tie the podcast a little bit more into the community. In the beginning, it was pretty separate. I did the podcast, but it was very difficult to see what effect that had on the community. And in fact, I think talking to other podcasters, it's always kind of hard to see what effect your podcast is having because it's not as trackable as a website, right? You're not, you don't really have Google Analytics attached to your podcast. It's not easy to see who's clicking which links unless you have specialized links. And people don't even click links. They have to like type them into their browser if you say them in the show. So for a long time, it was always kind of a black box. Like, why am I doing this? What kind of results is it getting? All I could really track were the download numbers, which always seemed to be going up slowly but surely. And so that was encouraging. But like, I didn't get any feedback. People wouldn't like tweet me and be like, great episode. Like, very rarely did that happen. And so I always was kind of wondering, what's the point of doing this? I enjoy doing it. And people I talk to in person seem to care about it, but it wasn't really a part of Indie Hackers for a long time. It always seemed like, as you said, kind of a side project. In recent weeks, we started doing quick chat episodes, which are a whole nother type of Indie Hackers podcast where I just bring somebody up from the community and put them on the podcast. And so this has been a pretty cool experiment because it's very related to the rest of the website. I'm literally picking people off of the forum who've made good posts and inviting them onto the show. And so people are now participating in the community with sort of the expectation or the hope that they'll make it onto the podcast. And then on the podcast, we also talk about the community a lot. And we talk about the posts that they're making. So it's very synergistic. It's very interconnected. And I really enjoyed bringing that vibe to things.
Speaking of the community, I saw a post, I think it was like an AMA on the podcast, but you recently sort of outlined the downloads per episode. I think you said you're averaging about 40,000 downloads per episode. And like within the first month of release or something like that?
Yep, that's exactly it.
60 days.
Yeah.
Okay. Looking back, do you see like a stair-step trend line of growth? And if so, can you kind of outline each of those steps?
Yeah, I'm going to load up my stats real quick and see. So I started the podcast, let's see, in February of 2017. And it is now August 2019. So it's been almost exactly a year and a half since the first few episodes. And it's almost like a perfectly straight linear line up and to the right. It's not super steep, but there aren't any permanent like steps. Now there are times where it goes down and then it goes back up again. And it correlates perfectly with times where I took a break from the podcast or times where I missed episodes. And so it's been like pretty consistent that if I am consistent in releasing episodes, the downloads will go up. And if I'm inconsistent, they'll stagnate or go back down, but then catch up quickly when I start recording a bit more. There is one stair step, however, and that occurred about a month ago, which coincides with us doing the quick chat episodes. So now instead of releasing one episode per week, Indie Hackers is 2 episodes per week, the full hour-long episode every Monday, where I'll take usually a famous guest or a super successful guest making hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars a year with their business. And the quick chat episodes where I take somebody from the community who oftentimes is not making any money or is only making a few $100s a month, which come out on Fridays, and those are only half an hour long episodes. So I think just having double the episodes is giving people double the content to listen to. And unsurprisingly, the download numbers over the last month have been significantly higher than they were before. It was definitely a step change.
And are they performing about the same as the hour-long episodes? I know sometimes when we introduce a second episode, it can perform a little differently. But how's that looking?
Yeah, I haven't actually compared in tremendous detail, but I can look right now. So if I go to the per episode download stats, the latest quick chat episode, let's look in the last month. From what I recall, they're performing pretty close. And the feedback I've gotten has been tremendous. Like I know the very first quick chat episode got more downloads that week than the full episode got that week because people were so fascinated about it. Yeah, so overall, they get fewer downloads than the full episodes. The full episodes I've recorded in the last few weeks have gotten more downloads than the quick chats by about 50%. But it's still adding a lot to the download count. It's like what's enabled that step change because the full episodes aren't getting like more downloads in the last month. It's only the additional quick chat episodes that are getting downloads, which is pretty cool for me because the quick chat episodes are so much easier to record. It's half an hour. It's informal. I don't prepare a lot of questions in advance. I don't spend as much time, combing over the episode with the fine-tooth comb before I send it to you to edit it. And so they tend to be quicker to produce. I could probably do 3 or 4 quick chat episodes a week if I really wanted to, and it wouldn't take that much longer to put those out than it takes me to record them.
I think it's really cool because this is just my assumption, is that those could be arguably more beneficial to the community because it's sort of like everybody's on an even playing field. When you're interviewing the guy making $1 million a month, like the principles might be the same, but the action steps look considerably different versus to the guy that like me, like a new business owner making only a couple $100s a month. So it's easier to see like the through line between getting from like 0 to 1,000 instead of like 200 to 1 million.
Yeah, exactly. That's the feedback that I've gotten. It's been It's been a good experiment connecting the podcast with the community because, like you're pointing out, the people who come on the quick chat are from the community, which means they're better representatives of other people who are in the community. They're just more relatable. They're kind of the same stages. And it's been the first actual interaction I've seen between the podcast and the community itself. So I think they're more beneficial for a lot of people. They're more educational. But also, like the people I'm interviewing in the quick chat episodes, like they have smaller audiences. If they tweet their episode, they're tweeting it to a few hundred people, not tens of thousands of people. Like, for example, Jason Fried might be tweeting to when he shares this episode. So it's not shocking that the download numbers are lower, but I'm also not surprised that I'm getting such positive feedback on the quick chat episodes. One other thing I'll add to that is I mentioned that I send out a survey to people who join Indie Hackers, and I also send out another survey about 60 days after you join. And so they both kind of ask you what parts of the site are you familiar with, but the second one asks you which part of the site are you getting the most benefit from. And the podcast ranks number 1 on the second survey, and it also, on the very first survey, there's kind of a question that asks, how did you first hear about Indie Hackers? And the podcast is also the number 1 source of how people first come to the community. And so I'm curious to see how that trend line will go in the coming months with the new quick chat episodes coming out and being more targeted at these early stage founders who are like the ideal Indie Hackers users. But yeah, it's really cool to see the fact that people are actually coming to the website because of the podcast, which was not the case 2 years ago. It was the exact opposite. The only reason anyone even heard of the podcast was because they were on the website. So it's sort of flipped around in terms of which one leads to the other.
Besides consistency, what else are you doing to drive growth of the podcast?
Honestly, man, very little. I don't think too much about trying to grow the podcast deliberately. I mean, there are a few things. Like I'll ask guests to tweet their episodes, but I'm not pushy about it. In fact, I explicitly say only if you think it was good and you want to tweet it. We send it out in our newsletter, which I think is a good way for our existing audience to sort of know about the episode. But to be honest, like that's something I've always done. It's not something I can really say, well, here's the result before and after, because there was never a time where I didn't do that. But mostly what I think about is just episode quality. Like my number 2 most popular episode of all time was with a good friend of mine, Len Tai, and her episode was just amazing. You could tell by listening to it that we were really good friends. We had really good rapport. She was a great and like entertaining storyteller, and she had almost no audience online. Like she had very few Twitter followers compared to many of my other podcast guests, but she has 84,000 downloads for her episode and climbing. It'll probably be number 1 a year from now. And that's not because I did anything special to promote it. It's just because it was a good episode. And people listened to it and said, wow, that was great. I need to listen to it again. Or I need to tell my friends to listen to it. And she gets a ridiculous number of emails. Like she hates how much email she's getting as a result of that episode. But ever since that came out, I've thought about, why did this episode do so well? And how do I grow the podcast? And I think the answer is just consistency, but not just in terms of releasing episodes, but in terms of quality. The better the episodes are, the more people are likely to share them with their friends and listen to them multiple times. And so the podcast grows. And so kind of the feeling I have in my head with how to grow the podcast is every week I want to make sure I have great episodes. And I'm like emotionally attached to this like chain. Like how many great episodes have there been in a row? And I feel bad whenever there's an episode that I don't think is amazing because it's like, oh, I've broken the chain. I need to get back on it. But hopefully I can get to a point where every episode is amazing. And there's this unbroken chain where people listen over and over again, and every episode meets or exceeds their expectations. So that's what I really want to be the case. I never want someone who's like told about the Indie Hackers podcast to download it and look at the latest episode and it be kind of a lackluster episode and they never come back. I want every episode to be amazing. And I think word of mouth growth is pretty much unbeatable.
What do you do to prepare for your interviews? Because I have to say they are very, very pointed, direct, and actionable. And I'm just curious to know your thought process when it comes to outlining and creating questions and just what goes through your head during a podcast.
Yeah, there's a lot. I'm a very active interviewer. The entire time I'm interviewing someone, I'm like, I've got my computer up. I do video interviews. Only a few interviews have been in person. So I'm able to like type and take notes as they're talking and prepare my next question. But before that, I spent a lot of time researching the guest and coming up with questions. So I'll spend a couple hours listening to other podcasts that the guest has been on, a couple hours reading tweets that they've made or blog posts that they've written, and just sort of taking notes on things that I find interesting about their story or their personality or their viewpoints. And then I'll sit down and spend another couple hours coming up with questions to ask them. And this process is like admittedly not very fun when I'm rushing it, when I'm like, oh, I've got other stuff to do. I want this to go by as fast as possible. It's not fun at all. But when I'm taking my time and just sort of enjoying like who this person is and what they put out there and engaging with like their thoughts, it's actually really fun to do. especially the part at the end where you're coming up with questions, because you'll come up with questions that are pretty mediocre. That'll be like, so-and-so, how did you come up with your idea? Or how did you get started? It's a very straightforward question. It's not a bad question. It's just very straightforward. But when you look over that question a second or third time, there's all sorts of ways to make it more interesting or to spruce it up. So I've got like a few tricks. Like generally, I think questions are better if they're unique. And the second you've asked that question, the guest thinks, wow, no one's ever asked me that question before. And listeners think, oh, I really am curious to know what the answer to that question is going to be. And so in order to make a unique question, I try to combine the question with some other concept that is somehow related to the guest. And usually if you combine two concepts, like the combination of those two things is pretty unique or at least pretty rare. So let's see if I can come up with an example off the top of my head. I don't know, like if I'm talking to a guest and I notice that they are a huge fan of a particular author, instead of just asking them, how did you come up with your idea? I'll say, hey, you're a big fan of Charlie Munger's writing. Charlie Munger recommends a ton of mental techniques to be a clearer thinker. How did that influence the way that you came up with your idea? And now it's not just a normal question, but it's kind of mixed together with this other concept that makes it interesting. And anyone who's listening is like, ooh, I wonder what the answer is. And the guests especially appreciate that because it's like, oh, wow, you've taken time to learn what I'm into, learn what I like, learn what I know about. I can answer these questions easily. I don't have to feel nervous because you're asking about things that I'm naturally interested in. And they just like are more energetic and they're more, I think, able to give interesting, good answers to what they're saying. So that's kind of one trick I use. Another one would be to try to give guests a good intro in the beginning. I've sort of waffled and experimented with this, and this is like sort of my latest incarnation of what I think is good. But guests seem to really appreciate it when I give them a great intro right off the bat, when I really build them up and talk about what they've done and make it fun. Usually they'll be like, wow, that's a great intro, and they're just more excited. And I think the hallmark of a good episode, going back to Len's episode, for example, is the guest having a ton of energy. It's really good when the guest is excited to talk about what they're up to and excited to give their answers, because you can kind of feel that as a listener. And ideally, I can keep that going from the beginning to the end of the episode. But at the very least, it should be in the beginning of the episode. So that's like a small trick that I kind of have recently started to try to use. God, I have a lot more. I'm sort of blanking on it. Like, it's hard to just recall them from memory, but there's like a lot of different things I try to use to come up with better questions. And I don't always do this. Like, there's a lot of interviews where I'm just lazy and I don't prepare until like an hour or two beforehand. And then that's like enough time to get a kind of okay interview. But if you hear me asking a lot of questions that are like, hey, what happened next? Or what came after that? That's usually when I didn't do as much prep as I would have liked to do.
When you just throw out the script entirely.
Exactly. And sometimes those episodes are pretty good. Like having a conversational tone with your guest is a lot better than like just like a rote script. Yeah. But it's also, I feel like coming up with not a script, but like a list of questions and interesting topics, even just doing that makes it easier to have a free-flowing conversation that's interesting. So with my friend Len, I could do a free-flowing conversation because I already knew what was interesting to her, and I already kind of knew the high points in her story. But the total stranger, if I don't know that stuff, then my questions are always going to be like, what happened next? And they might say something that they have a great story about, but I won't know they have a great story about it. And so it won't be as easy for me to have just like an off-the-cuff conversation where they actually hit these high points. So even having those sort of casual, informal conversations, they're better when you've prepared.
Speaking of great stories, I'm really curious to know what led you to podcasting to begin with. Everybody's always got a different angle of it. And I'm curious.
I was pushed into it, man. It was not... I was pushed into it kicking and streaming because I did not want to start a podcast. In the early days of Indie Hackers, it was just a blog and a newsletter. And then it was a community forum. And I was super into the community forum because, number one, I just found it really fun to post on it. But number two, it kind of, I don't know, had a mind of its own. People would come and they would help each other out. They would ask questions and answer each other's questions. And even if I wasn't there, it seemed to be this thing that was growing and living and breathing by itself, which was awesome to me because then I could focus on other things. Whereas the stuff where I actually had to produce content, writing interviews on the website, writing a newsletter, that kind of stuff was endless. Every single week I got on my newsletter and I would breathe a sigh of relief, but it turns out like there's just another newsletter to write next week and I would have to worry about it and it's endless and thankless. And so early on when I was doing these blog posts where I'd interview people, I got a lot of feedback from people who said, you need to turn this into a podcast. This would be such a great podcast. So I'd love to listen to this on my way to work. I'd love to listen while I'm cooking or cleaning or in my car. And I just kind of told all those people, yeah, maybe one day. It's a great idea. Like, stay tuned. But I had no plans whatsoever to have a podcast. I was like, that's the last thing I want to do, add another sort of endless amount of work to my plate. But then I appeared on somebody else's podcast. It was the Software Engineering Daily podcast with Jeff Meyerson. And Jeff has since become a good friend of mine, but he was an avid reader of Indie Hackers. And after we recorded an episode for his show, he spent like 10 minutes just grilling me. Like, Courtland, why don't you have a podcast? It's such a great business. It's amazing. It's a good revenue stream. It helps you connect with people on a deeper, more engaged level than just blog posts and a newsletter can. You know what? I'll make it easy for you. And he just gave me his entire playbook for how he runs his podcast, the tools he uses, the sponsors he uses to sort of fund the show. And he just made it like so easy for me that I had no excuse to say no. And so I sort of committed. And then I was like on the hook to actually do it. And I still went into it a little bit reluctantly, but I think just having like a little bit of a smaller step to take because someone else had made it easier for me and made me more comfortable was probably the only reason I decided to get started in the first place.
Well, I think I remember you saying somewhere either in writing or it might have been one of the podcast episodes that you're a bit of an introvert.
Oh yeah, I'm a huge introvert, man. I don't know where I fall on the scale. I'm probably like 60-40 introvert, extrovert. Like there are times where I can get super into having conversations. And if I'm with people that I'm comfortable around, I could talk forever. But I mostly sit in my apartment working on Indie Hackers, watching anime, reading books, like doing whatever I want. I'm not like the kind of guy who's going out to parties and going out to events all the time because I need to be social.
Right. Me either.
Yeah.
What kind of anime do you watch? Just curious.
All of it, man. I probably watched 100 animes. I'm a really big fan of stories and storytelling in general. I love a good story. I love like a very internally consistent story with great characters who are varied and their decisions make a lot of sense and it's exciting, but at the same time, it's like complex. Those are my favorite types of movies. Those are my favorite types of books and shows. And so I'm kind of like a critic. You know, I like to watch movies and anime, and the entire time I'm watching it, I'm like, oh, here's what I would do different, etc. So maybe one day I'll like be a manga artist or a screenwriter or something. But yeah, I spend a lot of time at home. It's basically what I'm getting at, which is ironically not that uncommon for people who run online communities. Most of my friends who also run big community sites, Ryan Hoover at Product Hunt, for example, my friend Kadrian, he runs a community for women in tech called Alpha, countless other examples. I've talked to them about this, and they're all, to a person, introverts. I don't know why that is. Maybe the extroverts are too busy building like real in-person communities, but it's not that uncommon.
I feel like there's way more introverts in the media space than people really realize. Whether it is like outside of just communities, I feel like there's so many people like even here in Hollywood that are like that. And like you talk to these people, they might be like crazy on screen, but they're really just like that introvert guy that just like hangs out at their apartment by himself or with their significant other and like plays video games and reads books and they're supposed to be this big, crazy, larger than life figure. And I think that's amazing. I think that's amazing because I feel like the introverts have that self-awareness, but it's so often anxiety that holds us back. Have you ever felt anxious when you first started the podcast?
Oh yeah, I still feel anxious, man. It's never.
How do you break through that?
Okay, let me temper that a little bit. I definitely felt a lot more nervous in the beginning. There's basically two types of creative work that you can do. I would say one type is practice-based and one type is editing-based. So like practice would be something like you're a basketball player. You practice a ton, but then you have to give an actual performance. You have to go out and play in that game, and you hope your practice pays off. And if it doesn't, oh well, that's all everybody saw was the actual live performance. Versus like editing-based creation, that's stuff like writing a blog post, writing a newsletter, building a website, editing an audio file. At that point, like you can spend as much time as you want editing that thing before you release it to the world, and you can get it as good as you want. You can make sure it reaches your standards, and you just have to never release. You can just never release anything that doesn't match your standards. Well, I like that. I
want to pause you there. A lot of people just get stuck there.
Yes.
Like, admittedly, even I was like, this whole idea of the podcast training site, like I mentioned this to you years ago.
Right.
And I got stuck.
Yes, that is a risk when you are not doing any sort of like practice performance-based creativity, right? You can hold back your creation indefinitely forever, and there's nothing sort of forcing you to get it out unless you set that up by yourself. So that's a risk. But there are all sorts of tricks you can use to sort of avoid getting stuck there. A lot of it is admittedly easier said than done. But once you've been bitten by that a few times, you sort of learn how you work. You learn what helps you get things out there, what hinders you, and you can sort of counteract that. So for me, for example, I know from previous experience that if I build something that requires a lot of code, I'm such a perfectionist that it's going to take me months, if not years, before I'm ready for the public to see it. And so I kind of only allow myself to work on things, websites and apps, for example, that require very little code. Indie Hackers was a blog when I launched it. You don't need a lot of code to write a blog. In fact, you can launch a blog with no code. And so I just don't allow myself to go down that rabbit hole because I know I'll get stuck forever. The podcast was nerve-wracking to me when I first started because the podcast was not editing based. I didn't get that perfectionist control. It was me and another person who I'm interviewing, and there's very little that I could do, or so I thought at the time, to help that person be a better guest. And if things didn't go right, then that would reflect poorly on me or poorly on the guest or poorly on the show and the community as a whole. And it would be this sort of disaster, or I wouldn't want to release an episode, but I wouldn't want to tell the guests that I'm not going to release their episode. I was just very nervous about it. And so going into every episode, I was like, this is high stakes. I've got one shot at this. And if it's not good, it's not good. So it took me actually, I think 3 months from the time that I said that I was going to do a podcast to actually get 3 episodes recorded and feel good about releasing the show and getting it out to the world. And that's just because I was so nervous. And even then, it took me probably like a year of releasing episodes weekly before I stopped having that pre-episode anxiety where I would get super nervous before having a guest hop into the room and like answer my questions. And I don't know why that was. I don't know why it took so long. I got a lot of good feedback. People liked the show, but I was always so worried that they weren't going to like the show. Nowadays, I don't feel that worry. I feel a little bit more apathetic. Like if they don't like it, they don't like it. But people seem to like it. I think the thing that I worry about the most is if I haven't prepared well for a guest. I feel guilty because I don't want to waste that guest's time. I don't want to be a host who hasn't really done a good job preparing. But even then, I don't think I've ever had a guest who's felt that way, even when I've been worried about it. So maybe a year from now, even that feeling of anxiety would be gone. And no matter what happens, I'll always feel great. Who knows?
I think that's an important note for everybody out there. Is just like everybody feels super anxious at first, but the more you do it, the more comfortable with it you become. Even sitting down with you today, like I felt it, and you just kind of got to push through.
Yeah, of course.
What would you say?
I think one thing to know is like an interviewer for an interview style podcast, because you can do a podcast where you're not interviewing anyone, it's just you talking, is that the pressure is usually more on your guests to perform. And listeners, as long as you're not doing anything egregiously bad as an interviewer, they generally judge the show by the quality of the guest and how the guest performs. And so really internalizing that, I think, has helped me to feel a little bit less nervous. I'm kind of like, I'm just asking questions, and I can try to make my questions interesting. But I've also watched videos of some of the best interviewers in the world, and very often, like, their questions are pretty straightforward. And what makes them great interviewers is they're good at finding the right guest who's going to be charismatic, who has a good story to tell, and just making sure the guest tells that story. And so I think if you're ever feeling that nervousness, just realize that like, the pressure is on your guest. The episode's probably going to be named after them. People are listening to hear what they have to say, more so than they're listening to hear what you have to say as the interviewer. And so all you have to do is just like some minimum level of preparation for some interesting questions and get out of the way. And it's really not on you.
Have you ever over-prepared?
Oh, yeah, all the time. I mean, I probably don't ask half the questions that I want to. Like I interviewed Jason Fried 3 weeks ago. I read like 2 of his books. I had like 50 questions that I'd written down. I had so much just ready.
Wow.
But we only had like an hour and 15 minutes to chat. And that goes by in the blink of an eye if you're having a decent conversation. And we got into a very comfortable mode where we just started having a casual chat. Like at some point we started talking about like how weird Japan is. I don't know why. That wasn't in my questions. We just got onto that topic that we were both naturally interested in. And so I had all these questions that I wanted to ask that I didn't get to ask. But the good thing is, not only was it a great episode, but because he had a good time, he's willing to come back and do another episode. And because I didn't get to ask so many different questions about so many topics, people could tell that there was more to talk to him about. And so they'll be excited to tune into episode number 2 whenever that happens. So it's not the worst thing in the world to over-prepare. You just obviously spend a little bit more time than you really needed to.
Okay, let's take a sharp left turn and go back in time. What would you tell yourself now? Like if you had a time machine, sounds so cliche. What would you tell Courtland back in 2017, right before he started the podcast?
I'd say, number 1, it's a good idea to start the podcast. Keep it going. Don't worry that it's not a good idea. It will grow slowly, but it will grow consistently as long as you are consistent. So keep at it. I would say do things in advance. Book guests well in advance. Prepare your questions well in advance. Give it the time that it needs. I was very focused at the time on like and I still am to a degree, like coding the website and like doing the newsletter, like doing all the other parts of Indie Hackers. But the problem is that if you're prioritizing other things more than your podcast, then every second you spend on your podcast is going to feel rushed. It's going to feel like a waste. You're just going to be thinking about the next thing you have to do while you're working on your podcast. And that's going to suck all the joy and the fun out of working on the podcast. If you have a podcast, especially if you have an interview show, it's like a naturally fun thing. It's naturally fun to learn about a person and get to have a conversation with them. And so I would say like allow yourself to enjoy that process, and you're going to do a better job, and you're going to be less stressed about it. And yeah, it's going to take more time. You'll get to other things a little bit later than you would like, but like that's fine. It's totally worth it. You should enjoy the work you're doing instead of only doing it as sort of a means to an end. Yeah.
What would you say to other people building communities that are thinking about starting podcasts themselves?
I would say you should know why you want to start a podcast. Like, what are you going to get out of it? A huge percentage of people who start podcasts, they end up quitting before episode number 10 because it's a lot of work. It's a lot of time. And if you're not getting some actual real return from that, then you're going to ask yourself pretty soon, like, why am I putting in all this time? And you're going to stop doing it. I think that's doubly true if you don't already have a big audience of people who are really hungry for the type of content that you're putting out. Like I had that with Indie Hackers. I had thousands of people coming to the website. I had 5,000 or 6,000 people on my mailing list by the time I started the podcast. And so I had people to send these episodes to. And my first batch of episodes already were getting like 800 or 900 downloads each from day one, which is not monumental, but it's a lot better than like 1 or 2 downloads, which a lot of podcasters start with. And so if you don't have that, you're not going to be motivated to continue from the download numbers. So you got to know what you want. And that can be anything, right? You want to build up an audience so that you can generate revenue from advertisers. You want to use it as a lead gen funnel to a particular page. You want to use it to meet interesting people so you can connect with them and work with them in some sort of professional capacity. You want to use it to build up an audience of people who follow your story so they're more engaged with your product or your company. Like whatever it is, you should know very clearly what you want to get out of it. And you should have like ideally just like one metric that you can use to track that you're heading in that direction. And then you should be aware that it's going to take you a lot of time, a lot of investment. Like you should commit to a certain number of episodes, I think, in advance and give it that much time to grow. So for me, I knew I was going to get to 100 episodes no matter what. I called episode number 1 of the Indie Hackers podcast, episode 001. And I put that right in the title to sort of force myself to get to 3-digit numbers because it would look stupid if I only did 50 episodes of the Indie Hackers podcast and they all had like that extra 0 in the front. So that was kind of my trick to persuade myself to go the distance and get to 100 episodes, which I just got to a few weeks ago. And I would say, yeah, if you're going to start something, make sure it's worth it so you can see it through to the end. You know, I think what I'll add is that when you're doing a podcast, especially an interview show, it's important to think about what your listeners want to get out of it. And that means talking to your listeners. I think the outro of Indie Hackers, I recorded it like 2 years ago and we haven't really updated it, but it's kind of just asking people for reviews on iTunes because I thought that would make the show grow. Now, I'm not convinced that helps the show grow at all. I think it's just kind of BS. What would be even better is if I had like a link to a form or something where I asked people who are listening to chime in with their thoughts about the show. You know, just send me a quick blurb, how I can make the show better. Why do you listen to the show? What do you get out of it? What do you like? What do you not like? Because I think my sensibilities around that have sort of evolved over time. And in the beginning, I didn't really have a model for why people listened. And I didn't really even think about it. I just kind of asked questions. Nowadays, I can like see a question and I can instantly tell, like, is this question phrased in a way where listeners who hear this are going to be eager to hear the answer because it's going to tell them something that they want to know. So if you are a listener and I'm interviewing, I don't know, Chris Savage from Wistia, you don't really want me to ask Chris questions about like, how did you get started as an entrepreneur? Like, that's not what you're interested in. Like, you don't care how Chris Savage got started as an entrepreneur. Right. You care about how you can get started as an entrepreneur. Or at the very least, you care about hearing an entertaining story, right? So I should phrase my questions and ask questions that sort of align with the things that you want to hear. For example, you might want to hear about how Chris made the decision to quit his job and join and start his own company and like what kinds of factors he considered, because you're trying to think about making that same decision and what kind of factors you should consider. And so now I try to ask questions that have that in mind, really. And another thing like in the same vein is, I think especially if you're interviewing people, ideally you're bringing people on who know more about something than you do. And in that case, I think it's kind of cool as an interviewer to just learn from your guests, just to basically learn in public. And I think people who are listening just get so much value out of interviewers who are learning from their guests and learning in public, more so than they do from interviewers who are like trying to teach their guests something. And this is a transition that like I am currently in the process of making. How can I learn more from my guest on the air? How can I ask more questions that teach me something rather than questions that I already sort of know the answer to? So general theme here is just think about your listeners and what they want to get out of your podcast. And if you really hit on that, I think you're more likely to be able to show that people recommend, that people listen to every week, and that people really just stick with.
Love it. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people find you online?
I am at CS Allen, CSALEN on Twitter. I don't tweet very often, but when I do, I try to make it impactful.
Epic.
Yeah. And I also run indiehackers.com. That's INDIE hackers.com. If you want to check out the podcast, just go there and click podcast at the top. And if you want to check out the community forum, it's right there on the homepage.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bradley.